So now we're looking at the 1700s. So if we were saying that the 1600s was when race was kind of invented, and you remember the slave code, you know, where you had this idea of, we're going to call these people white people and these people black people, and we're going to separate them. Well, I think that in the 1700s was when, building on from that, you had what I would call a centering of whiteness. When I look at this century, what I see with my limited vision is that you had a century of people seeing and making theories about how white was the center of everything, that the first people created were white, that the most beautiful people were white, and all this kind of stuff. I think we'll see that as we go through this century. Bear in mind, we're looking at a whole 100-year period, so there'll be so much stuff that's missed out. And bear in mind, we're looking at British history here, so we're going to miss out a whole bunch of stuff that happened in America, but sometimes we're going to mention stuff that happened in America because it had bearing on what happened in England. So let's just start off with 1718. You get the Transportation Act. And this meant that now it was legal to send convicts to American colonies as indentured servants. Remember last time we looked at what indentured servants were. So these were convicts, and they actually got called scum and dregs. Okay, so bear in mind then here at this period, and we saw this the previous years we've studied as well, there's a lack of dignity given to people who are seen as at the bottom of the pile, that they would actually be called scum and dregs. And bear in mind as well that so far what we've seen in our history is that there was like classism first, there was slavery first, and then the concept of race got invented. And what you then saw happen with black slavery, transatlantic slavery, and race-based slavery, as some people has called it, that is like an extension or an outworking of the classism that and the slavery that already existed. Okay, so there's a link there. And like we saw in the last century, people tried to separate those links. They didn't want white people at the bottom of the pile to be linking arms with black people at the bottom of the pile. And there was this mentality we even saw in the last century that there was that Calvinist preacher who referred to people at the bottom of the pile, white quote unquote people, who he referred to similar language as now how they're called scum and dregs. Now, a few years later, 1725, you get a guy called William Whitson who writes an essay about the curse on Cain in the Bible and the curse on Lamech in the Bible. And this guy Whitson, right, he was a monogenist. And what's confusing is that different authors use different terms for monogenists and polygenists. Sometimes there's couple of extra letters put in there, making it even more of a tongue twister. We're going to go with this spelling of monogenist. This is someone who believes that all of humanity came from one person. Okay, it normally means they believe all of humanity came from Adam. Whereas a polygenist is someone who thinks that there were actually lots of different people like Adam from which different groups of people descended, in other words, different races. And Whitson was a monogenist, so at first you're like, well, that's cool. He believed what the Bible says about all of humanity coming from Adam, but he also denied the Trinity. Okay, so he didn't actually believe in the Trinity. And he argued that Adam and Eve were, quote unquote, proper whites. Okay, and he said that the curse of Cain and the curse of Lamech was a change of skin color. Okay, we've covered this before. Now with Cain, he thought that Cain was, quote, changed to the remotest species and color of a perfect black. Whereas with Lamech's 4 children, he said that they each had a change to somewhere between olive and black. So they were somewhere on that continuum, whereas Cain was perfect black. And when he talked about Lamech's offspring, he said that they ended up becoming the Africans, the Amerindians, the East Indians, and the Hottentots, who were a South African people group. And the Hottentots he called, in quote, the lowest degree of human nature, end quote. So notice he's talking about degrees of human nature and he's linking it to skin tone, right? But he's also saying that this skin tone is temporary, right? Because he says this, he says, I incline to think it will be taken off. That means their skin tone, their blackness, their non-whiteness. It will be taken off upon their general conversion to Christianity. So I think what he means, this is me reading this 200 and something years later, 300 years later. I think what he's saying is that these people groups, they had their skin tone as a curse from God. And once enough people in that people group had become Christian, that then the curse would be removed and they would end up losing their skin tone and they would be like white people. So I think that's what he means. And what we can say, however he means it, is that he's linking conversion with whiteness. He's linking putting your faith in Jesus Christ with having white skin. Okay, which is quite deep, really. And that has implications for today, how people think about Christianity. And I bet many of us have had conversations where someone has said to us, Christianity is a white man's religion. And we have sympathy for people holding that position, because although we know historically it's not accurate, we also know that there are people who have linked conversion with whiteness, and there's been a whole history behind this. Now let's go on to the 1730s. You got John Wesley, the famous Methodist preacher, and he traveled to America and he was shocked at the slavery he saw in Georgia. And he was shocked that the slave owners were trying to keep the gospel from the slaves. Okay, we know about this. We know about slave owners taking parts out of the Bible so that the slaves wouldn't see the bits that show that the Bible's not cool with slavery. And if we think about our image of God categories, this is linked to the category of voice. You know, we saw how part of the function of being made in the image of God is that you hear God's voice and you pass on God's voice, his word, to other people. You use your voice to pass it on. And here what we're seeing is that instead of passing on God's word, the slave owners are keeping God's word from the slaves. And by doing that, they are dehumanizing themselves because they're not acting how an image bearer should. And they're also dehumanizing the slaves because they're preventing the slaves from hearing God's word. So you've got like double trouble going on here. And the question for us now is, does this still happen today? Are there people groups that we are not passing on God's word to who actually live in our communities? Are there people groups that maybe we are unwittingly ignoring, and really by the way we do outreach and the way we do church and the way we communicate the gospel, are we actually keeping the gospel from them? Okay, let's go on to the next decade, 1743. You got a Virginian doctor called John Mitchell who travels to London, and at the Royal Society of London, he gives an essay it's called An Essay Upon the Causes of the Different Colours of People in Different Climates. And this is one of the things people wrestled with in the 1700s, was how did black people come to be? Europeans and Americans were struggling with this question. And it's a very ethnocentric question, isn't it? Obviously, in Africa, people weren't wrestling with the question of how did black people come to be, right? So this is a question that shows how things were centered around whiteness. Now, what Mitchell said was, he said that the difference in skin color was a slight difference, that didn't give any reason to say that Negroes and white people weren't from the same stock, quote unquote. Okay, so this is actually very similar to modern science today. Okay, but what we will see in the next couple of 100 years is that it wasn't. Okay, so it's quite significant what Mitchell's saying here. And so in other words, look, skin color is a minor difference amongst humans, which we know today by DNA, that is a really minor difference. And so you're all from the same stock, which is a word that was used. Sometimes people say stock, sometimes people would say race. And he admitted that whilst white people look upon themselves as the primitive race of men, in other words, as they're the first race of men, from a certain superiority of worth, in other words, thinking that they are worth more, that white people are worth more, either supposed or assumed, white people have the least pretensions to it, because they have degenerated more from the tawny or swarthy colour of Noah's children. And what he's saying there is he's saying, look at Noah's descendants. Noah and his descendants, they had tawny skin or they had swarthy skin. And you might remember before I said, people didn't initially talk about skin tones as black and white. People would use other terms like swarthy skin. Now it's hard to imagine that because we're so conditioned to only talk about black and white. But he's arguing that mankind was originally having a darker skin, and white people, of all the people on the planet, are the people whose skin looks the least like the original humans. So he's saying you lot should be, and he's including himself, obviously, should be the most humble people, instead of being proud about, oh, we're the first people. So he's recognizing that people centered things on whiteness, and he's making an argument against that. So what this also shows us is that at this time, it was possible for an image bearer to make an assessment like this, contrary to assessments that some other people were saying. And the reason why this is significant is because you'll hear people say about slave owners and people who said very racist stuff and very unbiblical stuff in history. People will say, oh, he was a man of his times. Have you ever heard people say that? Yeah, they were just a man of their times. Well, what we find, you'll see this later in the 1700s as well, is that there were enough people in this time who were saying, hey, this is wrong. So it wasn't the case that if you were born in the 1700s, you just couldn't help see everything as centered on whiteness and see white as better than black. That wasn't the case. There were people who were speaking up against this, who, because of either the Bible or because of the scientific information they had, were able to tell that this stuff wasn't true. Okay, let's go on to the next decade. 1753, you got the Scottish philosopher David Hume. So this is really significant. This is one of the great Enlightenment philosophers. This is one of the people who shaped so much of how people ended up thinking in the world. And he wrote something called Of National Characters. And he put a footnote in it. And in this footnote, he said, I am apt to suspect the Negroes, and in general, all the other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 kinds, to be naturally inferior to the whites. Then he says, there never was a civilized nation of any complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. Okay, now, some of you in the Zoom meeting right now of Ghanaian heritage, your eyes must have fell out of your head when you read that line there. To think that there was someone claiming that there'd never been a civilized nation of any other complexion than white. I mean, why is David Hume saying this? I mean, surely he must have known about the great kingdom the great Ghanaian kingdom. Surely he must have known about that. I mean, Britain had been trading with Africa and getting its gold from Africa. Like, Britain didn't have its own gold industry in Yorkshire. You know, it was like it had to go to another nation that had worked out how to mine and how to trade in gold. And there were other kingdoms that in British culture, people used to talk about kings of Africa who had great wealth and everything. So the mind boggles why David Hume is saying this. He says, no ingenious manufactures amongst them, no arts, no sciences. On the other hand, the most rude and barbarous of the whites, such as the ancient Germans, the present Tartars, have still something eminent about them in their valor, form of government, or some other particular. So what he's saying here is, he's like, look, if you look at white people, look at the very lowest of the white people, and he's saying the ancient Germans, you know, and he's saying even they have had better ways of doing life than black people. He says such a uniform and constant difference could not happen in so many countries and ages if nature had not made an original distinction betwixt these breeds of men. So he's saying this is a nature thing. This is the way that they naturally are as people. And then he says, not to mention our colonies. There are Negro slaves dispersed all over Europe, of which none ever discovered any symptoms of ingenuity. Okay, that's pretty low, isn't it? Like, you have people enslaved working as your slaves, and then you say none of them have come up with any, you know, amazing inventions and stuff like that. I wonder if they were a bit busy working as slaves. David Hume. And then it says, though low people without education will start up amongst us and distinguish themselves in every profession. So what he's saying is, he's saying us white people, our poor people, they actually rise up and they do wonderful things. So the fact that the slaves haven't shows that there's some biological thing with them. And then he says, and I know some of you, as you heard David Hume saying these things, you've thought of loads of counter arguments and loads of examples where you could say, what about this? What about that? And all this kind of stuff. And David Hume admits there's an example that goes against his argument. But look what he says. He says, in Jamaica, indeed, they talk of one Negro as a man of parts and learning. But 'tis likely he is admired for very slender accomplishments, like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly. So he knows that his listeners will be like, what about that Jamaican dude, man? That guy, like, he levels. And David Hume's like, no. He's probably just being like a parrot. He's just copying. You know, it's like, this is one of our most famous philosophers, okay, who's made this very poor assessment. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Like, some of the people we've been taught about in history of the great thinkers, and they say something like that, and you know that that was passable back then. It says a lot. So let's think about his assessment. He's ignored the available history of African and Asian kingdoms and their ingenuity. He's totally missed that. He's assumed a complete knowledge of all non-white people. And I guess that shouldn't surprise us, because we're used to that today, innit? Loads of us would have seen memes in the last few weeks where someone says something like, well, black people only have a hard life because da-da-da-da-da. And you're like, really? Like those 4 bullet points? Like, you know, every single black person on the planet. And then what he's also done is he's ignored the effects of slavery, where you enslave people and then say, oh, they don't seem to be building empires at the top level like the white folks do. Well, that's ignoring the effects of slavery. There's only so much you can do from shackles. And he's dismissed a Jamaican example as being probably parrot-like. So obviously you could just turn back to him and say, well, all your examples of white people doing the great ingenuity, they're just being like parrots as well. you know, it's a bit of a silly argument. So, was Hume the only dodgy Enlightenment philosopher? Well, 1756, the great Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire, the Frenchman who lived down the road for a bit, he lived in Wandsworth in London for a bit, and he wrote in his essay on the manners of the nations, he said, "One regards the Jews the same way as one regards the Negroes, as a species of inferior humanity." Great Enlightenment thinker who's saying that some humans are inferior to others, that there's different species of humans, some of them are inferior, and Jews and Negroes are inferior species. Going against the doctrine that we're all made in the image of God, in contrast to the animals that were made according to their kinds, all of us have been made according to the divine type. Around the same time, 1758, you got Carl Linnaeus. Now, he's a Swedish botanist, and he categorized humans this way. He said you've got one group of humans who are from the Americas, and they are red. Their skin is red. Then he said you've got people from Europe, their skin is white. People from Asia, their skin is yellow. People from Africa, their skin is black. And then there are two subcategories of monster-like and feral humans. Okay, so there's these other two categories, this idea that there's monsters out there. And we saw this before, didn't we? That there were stories before that there were monsters in Africa. And this whole idea of like feral humans would be an idea that had actually come from, you know, years before, when in Europe you had white slavery, and the way people would talk about the white slaves, about how they have too many children and how they're described the same way that they get described today in certain newspapers. People, when newspapers describe people who live off benefits or people who live on council estates, they're kind of described as a feral mother or feral youth or whatever. So you actually had a botanist coming up in a science work with this actually a category. Can you imagine going to school and actually being taught this? Now, what's also interesting is that he's got like these sort of like 6 categories, but there were other scholars from the same time, and they came up with different systems. So some of them said there were 2 races. Others said that there were dozens of races. So there was no agreement about this. People were obsessed with trying to categorize humans into different groups, but no one could decide for sure how to categorize them. Okay, let's go to the 60s. 1762, you got a magistrate in England. He's called Sir John Fielding, and he complains about slaves that are coming from the West Indies, because slaves were coming from the West Indies and working alongside servants in England. And when I say they were coming from the West Indies, I don't mean like on holiday. I mean that slave owners were coming from the West Indies to England, and they were bringing their slaves with them. Now, technically, we didn't have slavery in England, but people would bring their slaves back to England. And so we did really have slavery unofficially. And what this magistrate said was, they no sooner arrive here than they put themselves on a footing with other servants, becoming intoxicated with liberty, grow refractory, and either by persuasion of others or from their own inclinations, begin to expect wages according to their own opinion of their merits. These enter into societies and make it their business to corrupt and dissatisfy the mind of every fresh black servant that comes to England, first by getting them christened or married, which they inform them makes them free. So, this bloke is putting across the idea that black slaves shouldn't better their position. And this is one of the funny things about British culture, isn't it? On the one hand, you get told you should better your position. If you don't better your position, you get looked down on, right? So if you stay in the council estate, you get looked down on. What people who live on a council estate, they must be feral and all this. If you carry on stacking shelves in Tesco's, oh, you're not a very important person like me. But at the same time, when you do try to better yourself, quote unquote, you then find you hit a glass ceiling and people say to you, stay in your lane. Someone like you shouldn't be trying to do this job, you know. And so this is this weird thing with British culture, that here you've got the idea that black slaves shouldn't try to better their position, that black servants shouldn't try to better their position. They shouldn't be ruling alongside white people, which again is a contrast with Genesis 1:26-28, that it's all humanity that's supposed to be ruling over the earth, not over one another. So a question for us is there still today a mentality that black people should be at the bottom? And is there any present resistance to black people climbing the ladder? And I think in popular discourse today, you do hear both of these ideas coming through, and they're contradictory, which makes things very difficult. But also, let's notice that with Fielding here, there's a fear of indigenous assessments spreading. He doesn't like the fact that there are black people talking about concepts of freedom because he sees it spreading and it's going to change the power dynamic. And so my question is, does this happen today? Is there a fear in some groups that there's other people of different classes, could be lower class people, or people of different ethnicities, could be black people? Is there a fear that the way they think about things, if it spreads too much, will change the power dynamics of the organization? So it's worth asking, in our networks, who has the power and who has the assessment? Because if they're middle-class white people only, then we might be following on an unhealthy tradition that's been going on a long time, that was going on through the slavery period. Okay, 1763, there's a conversation amongst some naturalists that was recorded about how black people came to be, this question that keeps coming up. And James Boswell recorded this conversation and said, recorded it in writing. I don't think they had dictaphones back then or phones or anything. And he said, it has been accounted for in three ways. So how are there black people? Either by saying they were the posterity of Ham, who was cursed, or that God at first created two kinds of men, one black and another white, or that by the heat of the sun, the skin is scorched and so acquires a sooty hue. And then he says, this matter has been canvassed among naturalists, but has never been brought to any certain issue. So there was no consensus about how black people came to be, but note as well, it's an ethnocentric question. It normalizes being white and thinking, well, there's no question of where white people came from. And then being like, but where did black people come from? It's an ethnocentric question. Okay, 1764, Immanuel Kant, famous Enlightenment philosopher, he wrote this. He said, the Negroes of Africa have by nature no feeling that rises above the trifling. He also split people into good and bad races. The good race is the white race, and the bad race is the non-white race. And he said that the good could be tainted by the bad. Okay, and that's an important concept there. The idea that there's different races and that one race could be tainted by another. Now, when you hear that today, it might not be shocking because you might have heard people talk about that. There's even people who talk about their own ethnicity. People talk about fears of if they marry outside of their own ethnicity, that their own ethnicity will get diluted. And so it's a real thing that is a concept in our minds today, but it wasn't always. And one of the reasons why it's in our mindset today is because of Immanuel Kant. Now, what Kant said, a bit like David Hume with his parrot thing. Kant said this. He said about some bloke. He said, "This fellow was quite black from head to toe, a clear proof that what he said was stupid." Okay, so he assessed a person and their intelligence, not based on their voice, not based on their assessment, but on their skin colour. And this is one of our famous philosophers who's helped shape the world we live in today. Okay, at this time, a lot of people's thoughts of Africans were still being influenced by Mandeville. Do you remember we saw you had Mandeville's Travels, you had Hakluyt, and you got the Curse of Ham myth. And all these things meant that a lot of people saw Africans as inferior, and slavery and exploitation was justified. So people would say, well, slavery is okay because these people are inferior people. People would say colonization is okay because these are inferior people. And what you could say is that these two books by Mandeville and Hakluyt, you could say that they acted like catechisms, training the English mindset about Africans. So think about that. Books are a form of enjoyment. Enjoyment is one of the functions of being made in the image of God. And here you've got an example of two books, two forms of enjoyment, influencing people's assessments, people's evaluations of Africans. And so the way we function as image bearers, we want to think today, how are forms of enjoyment influencing our views on race or class? So, for example, do all the shows like Benefit Street, all them kind of shows, which now are called, is it called poverty porn? Those kind of shows, how have they been influencing how we think about people in the lower classes? What about the entertainment industry? How do movies influence the way we view race? Now, there have been actors that have specifically, like there's been African-American actors who specifically took roles and turned down other roles because they said, look, if I take this role, it perpetuates a stereotype and that's not helpful. So I'm not going to take that role. I'm going to take other roles that change the way people see African-Americans. How many of us, the way we think about race and class, it has been influenced by the forms of enjoyment we have, by the music, even to the extent of, in the British imagination, how much is it the case that black people are seen as, hey, you guys can be great performers, but we don't really want you being politicians. Yeah. So there's something about Diane Abbott that to some people doesn't seem acceptable, but there's the idea of a black rapper or singer does seem acceptable. And we might come on to that a bit more later when we look in the future about the music scene and stuff. Okay. 1764 to 67. You got a guy called Winckelmann, and he's known as the father of art history. Did anyone here do art history? Okay, well, I wasn't expecting it, but if I had a more high-profile crowd here, maybe there'd be some art history majors. So this guy is the father of art history. So you might not have heard of him, but he wrote a book called The History of the Art of Antiquity. And in it, he said, the story of Winckelmann is hilarious, actually. You'll find out why it's funny in a minute. He argued we should embrace Greek life. And he idealized ancient Greek beauty. When you hear guys at this stage talking about Greek life, they're really talking about ancient Greek life. They're not talking about their Greece back then in the 1760s. He idealized ancient Greek beauty, and he thought that Chinese eyes were an offense against beauty. Okay, and he thought that Kalmucks, which is Mongolian, back then they would say Kalmuk, Kalmuck's noses were an irregularity. So we know today that that's an ethnocentric way of viewing beauty, right? But we also live in a world where we're used to seeing beauty portrayed a certain way, right? So people even get told at work sometimes, don't wear your hair like that. Don't come to work with whatever hairstyle unless it is a European hairstyle. Then it's like that is okay. And the same way we know stories of magazines like, or I don't want to say the names in case I get sued and I got the name wrong, but fashion magazines that have airbrushed black women's hair and changed it so that they conform to a more Eurocentric view of beauty. And this guy, this is what's hilarious. He praised Greek white skin. He was like, the beautiful skin is the ancient Greek white skin. Now, what's hilarious is this is totally based on a misunderstanding. So he had some sculptures, right? He thought they were Greek sculptures, but they were Roman copies of Greek sculptures. So Roman copies of ancient Greek sculptures. Now, the Roman copies of Greek sculptures were a smooth, snowy white marble. So when he looked at them, he was like, oh, the ancient Greek beauty. It's so white. But what the Romans had done was they'd copied the Greek originals that were a dark pitted marble and they were painted as well. So the ancient Greek concept of beauty was not white. But Winckelmann, by a mistake, thought it was and started praising whiteness. And he was followed by other scholars. So in Germany, you had Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, And what happens, you had what is called a Greco-Manic epidemic in Europe. So this idea spread across Europe, and suddenly the ancient Greek aesthetic and intelligence was idolized. But it was all based on a mistake, and it was all centering beauty around whiteness. Now, this obviously is tragic, but I also can't help thinking it's hilarious that this was a major factor in the centering of whiteness and seeing white as beautiful. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit now. The Church of England at this time sadly failed to use its voice well to speak God's word against man stealing. Bear in mind this whole time, all this stuff we're looking at, whilst this is going on, people are being kidnapped. The Bible calls this man stealing, okay? And David Olusoga says, it's important to remember how few voices were raised against slavery in Britain until the last quarter of the 18th century. The Church of England was largely silent on the issue, as were most of the politicians. To most people in Britain, until the 1770s and 80s, there seemed to be no way out. Britain was addicted to slave-produced products and therefore addicted to slavery. So Olusoga's pointing out that in Britain, we had an addiction to all the things that came from slavery. Things like sugar, things like cotton. And so that meant, why are we going to speak up about the issue of slavery when we so badly want our sugar and our cotton and the money that comes from slavery? And so what it shows is that we don't tend to be totally neutral about the issues we speak out on. And so an important question is, what topics do you hear the church speak out on today? What are the topics the church speaks out on? There's some topics that it seems the church is comfortable to speak out on, and there's other topics that the church isn't comfortable to speak out on. And we need to consider biblically, are we missing out some of the topics just like our forefathers did in the 1700s? Now, some people say, well, slavery, most of it was happening outside of Britain, so people didn't really see it. But people would see slaves that people were bringing into the ports and that had them living in their houses. So it's true that a lot of people, like in Britain, wouldn't have seen what plantations were like or what slave ships were like during the Middle Passage. But people would have had some exposure. And in 1765, in London, there was a slave, a black slave called Jonathan Strong. He was a young guy. I can't remember the exact age now, but I think he was a teenager or a young adult. He'd been badly beaten by his master, David Lyle. And these two brothers helped him. These two brothers are called the Sharp brothers. One of them's Granville Sharp, that we hear quite a bit more of. 2 years later, so this Jonathan Strong slave, I imagine David Lyle thought he was probably dead somewhere, that he died from his injuries or something, or that he was in bad shape somewhere. 2 years later, Lyle actually sees Strong. And so then he's like, right, well, I know where my slave is. I'm now going to sell him to a planter. Remember, planters were the guys who ran the plantations. There's a planter called Kerr, and he's like, I'm going to sell Jonathan Strong to Kerr. Well, one of the Sharp brothers finds out, Granville Sharp, and if you're wondering, yes, he is the Greek grammarian. If you've studied biblical Greek, you know about the Granville Sharp rule, and it was from this bloke here. Now, this guy was not a lawyer. And he was advised that it was a futile case. But check it out. He spent a year studying the law and then made the case that Jonathan Strong was a free man and not property. And he secured Jonathan Strong's freedom. I think that's quite amazing. Then 2 years later, in 1769, Granville Sharp publishes something called A Representation of the Injustice and Dangerous Tendency of Tolerating Slavery. And I've given you the rest of the title there. You can see they had long titles back then. And this was a combination of case law and natural law and Christian morals. So he didn't just stop with helping out Jonathan Strong. He was like, I've been studying the law now. I'm going to use the law and I'm going to use Christian morals to make a case to fight against slavery. So think about it. Sharp was using his assessment. He was using his power as a white Englishman, and he was using his voice. He was using all these things to serve and protect Jonathan Strong. He was acting like an image bearer is supposed to act. And then in 1772, there was a famous case called the Somerset Case. You can Google this to find out about it later. This hinged, and this was linked to the whole thing of if there's a slave in England, should their slave master be able to take them out of England, say like back to the West Indies without permission? And this case hinged on Sharp's argument that no man at this day is or can be a slave in England. And what this meant was that if, and this was about a bloke called Somerset, if Somerset was actually a man, then he could not be a slave in England. So it was actually up for debate at this stage whether a slave was a man. So you see how far people have drifted from the idea of being made in the image of God. In the same decade, around the 70s, you got a black British man called Ignatius Sancho. And in his letters, he called mankind the race of Adam. And I love that. He was centering on Adam instead of skin color. Okay. And he was giving a better assessment than Hume or Immanuel Kant. He was using his voice. He was using his power. And you might say, well, he didn't have a lot of power, but he was using his power, just sending out this message in his letters, the race of Adam. Okay, same decade, you've got Johann Caspar Lavater. He's a Swiss pastor. Okay, so he's, I think he's a physician, but he's also a pastor. I can't quite remember, look it up. And he wrote something called On Physiognomy. Won't try saying that again. And in this, he put in his idea that God gave people a face to mirror their inner state. Okay? And he said that the Grecian race was then, and he's talking about in antiquity, so the ancient Greek race was more beautiful than we are. They were better than us. And the present generation of Greeks is vilely degraded. Okay, so like Winckelmann, he saw the ancient Greeks as the ideal of beauty. And apologies, I was probably supposed to say Winckelmann, but being married to an American, I've got very used to pronouncing W's as W's when I say these names, how they do in America. That's my excuse. Now, notice that also, rather than Christ being the model of reflecting God well, as we should as image bearers, instead of that, the model is the ancient Greek race. So this is problematic. Notice how he's linking outer beauty to inner worth, rather than considering the worth that we all have of being made in the image of God. But this is a pastor. So obviously being a pastor does not inoculate you against coming up with ideas and spreading those ideas onto other people that are actually completely unbiblical. Now, also in the 70s, you got Petrus Camper. He's a Dutch member of the Royal Society, and he drew a diagram of skull measurements side by side. Now, there was a measurement of the angle of the skull that Camper was well known for. And with the first skull, the orangutan, the degree he measured, the angle was 58 degrees. The next skull was of a Negro, quote unquote, and it was 70 degrees. The next one was a Kalmuk, and it was again 70 degrees. And the next one was a European, which was 80 degrees. And lastly, there was a Greek god, which was 100 degrees. And of course, this is a bit ridiculous here, because you wouldn't be able to get hold of a skull of a Greek god. Obviously, I hope I don't have to explain that. So it's obviously getting a bit ridiculous here. It must be a sculpture of a Greek god. Maybe someone got a Greek god to sit still for a few minutes. Now, the point Camper was making was that the Negro, the Kalmuk, and the European, those three ones in the middle, look at the diagram there, the three ones in the middle, yeah? They were closer to each other than to the Greek god or the chimpanzee. That was the point he was trying to make. He was trying to say, look, the orangutan's totally different, the Greek god's totally different, the Negro, the Mongolian, and the European, they are similar. Poor bloke, he was trying to make that point. He did believe in the unity of humanity. He actually said that he thought Adam and Eve might have been black. Okay? But unfortunately, this picture of 5 heads was seen by other people as a hierarchy, and it became part of people's imagination on race. So what we learn from this is that people see what they want to see, or maybe people see what the flesh tells them to see. People see what the devil tells them to see, So people saw 5 skulls side by side, and they think that must be a hierarchy. Greek gods at the top, next is European, then it's Mongolian, then Negroid, and Negroid is close to a orangutan. Compare this today with memes that produce misleading stats. We've all seen them. There was even that guy who went out and shot a whole bunch of people. The beginning of his journey to white supremacy was from seeing one of those memes that gave misleading stats about black crime. And so it just shows how images are really important, and how people will believe stuff that sometimes the stats aren't even really showing. Same decade, 1774, you got a Polygenist. So this is a guy who believes that there were like lots of Adam and Eves, well, not necessarily lots of Adam and Eves, but a person who believes that there's been lots of sort of like atoms around the world, and you've had different people, different races come from these different atom type figures. Edward Long was a British Jamaican slave owner, and he saw black people as non-human and like monkeys. So he said this, he said, an orangutan husband would not disgrace a Negro woman. So he's saying it wouldn't be disgraceful for a Negro woman to have an orangutan husband. If you couldn't work out, he was a nasty man anyway, from the fact that he was a slave owner. What he said there is just, horrible. And his thinking is equating whiteness with humanity and blackness with animals, which obviously is totally not what Genesis 1 shows us. Okay, same year, there's a monogenist, okay, and it's worth knowing about these monogenists and polygynists because Akala talks about this in his book. It's something that a lot of people in London will have read in the last few years, and they might want to know, if you're a Christian, what do you think about the whole monogynist thing and the polygynist thing? And it's really good news that there were monogynists at this time saying what they were saying. Oliver Goldsmith, in The History of the Earth and Animated Nature, he said, "We've frequently seen white children produced from black parents, but I've never seen a black offspring the production of two whites." He also said, "Whiteness is the colour to which mankind naturally tends." And he said, "All those changes which the African, the Asiatic or the American undergo are but accidental deformities which a kinder climate, better nourishment or more civilised manners would in a couple of centuries very probably remove." So notice, on the one hand, you'd be like, well, I'm glad that there's a monogynist out there saying that we all come from Adam, because that means that we're all made in the image of God, that we have a universal brotherhood to a point. But also notice that he's still centering stuff on whiteness. He's still centering stuff on European skin color, and he actually sees black skin as a deformity. So there'll be some guys who would have right biblical views about the origin of mankind and still centering everything about whiteness in problematic ways. 1774, you got Lord Kharmes. It's Lord Kharmes. I'm not too sure. I'm not very Scottish, even though my name is Duncan Forbes. Sorry, my bad. He's a Scottish judge. And in the Sketches of the History of Man, he said that he thought that from the Tower of Babel, you had different peoples who would have lived as savages in their respective locations. And then over time, they would have adapted into different races. He was interpreted as promoting the co-Adamist heresy, that there were multiple Adam and Eves who started their own races. So that's how he's been interpreted. Co-Adamists. You've got Adam and Eve over here, you've got another group of some kind of Adam and Eve over here, another group of some kind of Adam and Eve over there, and all these different races come from there. Okay. The following year, you've got a monogynist, Johann Frederick Blumenbach. You've probably heard of him if you've looked into the history of race. He did a PhD on the natural variety of mankind, and he disproved the existence of monsters. So they were no longer scientifically viewed as part of humanity. Okay, so sigh of relief, the idea of monsters gone, but let's face it, by now, Africans are already being viewed as subhuman by so many people. We'll hear more about Blumenbach later. Same year and all the way through to 1783, you got the American War of Independence. Okay. 1777, Hume, he does a final edition of National Characters. It's posthumously published, and now the footnote that we looked at before, it's been removed, or at least they've removed the Polygenist part from it. So it looks like maybe Hume was like, oh, I don't really want to say stuff where I'd be interpreted as a Polygenist. And that got removed. If you want to look into that later, I'm sure you could find out all kinds of information about that. Okay, the historian E.P. Thompson, he says that round about this time, sort of in 1780, that in England, English workers started to identify with each other against their employers and rulers. I'm not really going to say much more about that other than to say it could be that at this time in England, you start getting some kind of class identity of we're the workers, and there's a difference between us and our bosses and our rulers in this country, which is just part of the class history of Britain. 1781, back to Blumenbach. He revises his On the Natural Variety of Mankind with 5 categories, including the newly added Malay. If you look up any of the footnotes here and you're like, whoa, I found some different years and dates for Blumenbach. Sometimes you'll find different sources quote different dates, and sometimes when you dig a little deeper, you find that someone's quoting Blumenbach's 2nd edition and someone else is quoting his 1st edition. And so sometimes people have slightly different years for them. So Blumenbach is now saying that you've got the European category, which is people from Europe to India and North Africa. Okay, so North Africa is considered as European by his categorizing. Then you got the Mongolians, then the Ethiopians, then the Americans, and then the Malays. So that's how he's dividing up humanity. Not everyone agrees with him, but he's kind of a don, and a lot of people do agree with him. Same year, you have the tragedy with the slave ship Zong. So 1781, 113 Africans are thrown overboard on the slave ship Zong when it runs into trouble. So they figure, best thing we could do is chuck these 113 Africans overboard and we get the insurance money. But when the slavers try to get the insurance money, they're told they can't because the slaves were seen the slaves who were seen as goods and not humans had been deliberately drowned. So that's the response. We can't give you the insurance money. You deliberately drown them. Okay. Now, the abolitionists at this time, they're like, these are the guys who are fighting against slavery. These are people like Granville Sharp, these kind of guys. And also a guy we hear about in a minute, Equiano, who is the guy who told Granville Sharp about what had happened with the slave ship Zong. The abolitionists said, hang on a minute, this is murder. I mean, you would have thought, yeah, it's a clear case of murder. You throw 113 people in the sea, that is mass murder, yeah? But the judge said, so far from the guilt of anything like a murderous act, so far from any show or suggestion of cruelty, there was not even a surmise of impropriety, and that to bring a charge of murder would argue nothing less than madness. Okay, so a judge was unable to assess correctly what a human was and what murder was. Okay, so Zong, I think, is an example of individual sin that is also together collectively results in a system of sin. A system is a set of things that work together. So think of Pharaoh with slavery with the Israelites in the book of Exodus. And you had a whole system there, which he had to have midwives working with him. He had to have slave masters working with him, and so on. Well, here with Zong, you've got individual kidnapping going on. You've got the transatlantic slave trade as a system that was condoned by law and condoned by the king. And you have individual acts of handling kidnapped persons on the Zong itself. The way they were treated was absolutely terrible. You've got murder You've got the people who actually threw them overboard. You've got the person who said throw them overboard and ordered them to do it. Then back in the UK, you've got a whole legal system that has a judge who denies there has been murder. And he's probably influenced by the whole view going around the whole country that Africans aren't humans, but they're goods. So this is what I would call a system of sin going on here. Okay. 1784, there's a gravestone of Philip Scipio in England, and it says on it, an African whose quality might have done honour to any nation or climate, and give us to see that virtue is confined to no country or complexion. So whoever wrote the gravestone is trying to let people know that this was a good guy, and that virtue is not confined to skin tone. Okay, they're trying to counter this. And towards the end of this century, abolitionists use stories of the good quality of slaves so that they can oppose the stereotypes. So they're opposing stereotypes with their assessments and with their voices. And that's something that we can be doing today as well. During this century, some slaves are freed from their masters when their masters died, but some ended up then being inherited by their masters' children. And some slaves viewed their baptism ceremony as the end of their chattel status. So it wasn't totally clear exactly when you could stop being a slave, and it would vary from situation to situation. 1786, there's a Scottish doctor called John Hunter, and he hinted that Adam might have been black by saying that skin tone always goes from the dark to the lighter tints. So with that belief, he was saying, it's most likely Adam was black then. Adam couldn't have been white, and you wouldn't have had black people. So there were some voices in this time who could evaluate and assess that humanity wasn't and shouldn't be centered around whiteness. So again, it goes against the men of their time myth that there were critics at this time of centering everything around whiteness. Same year, another Scotsman, John Pinkerton, did an essay on the origin of Scottish poetry, and he said, "To suppose all races of men descended from one parent is as absurd as to suppose that an ass may become a horse, or orangutan a man." Well, that's just amusing on all kinds of levels. So, yeah. Anyway. Following year, 1787, Thomas Jefferson. So obviously this is a guy in America, but this is obviously a very influential person, Thomas Jefferson. So I thought we should put this in here because no doubt there were ideas in America that had influence in England and vice versa. Thomas Jefferson, on his notes on the state of Virginia, said, and remember, Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner, had a lot of slaves. He said, "I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only, that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. It is not against experience to suppose that different species of the same genus or varieties of the same species may possess different qualifications." So he's making an assessment that's wrong, that black people are biologically less intelligent and that they're physically inferior. He's also assessing them as belonging to a different species or genus, which again goes against Genesis 1. Okay, 1787, you've got the Society for Effecting Abolition of the Slave Trade. This is the year it gets founded in London by Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, and 10 others who, they're mainly Quakers, but there are Anglicans as well. And their views were based on their religion compared to other philosophical ideas at the time. There were some people at the time who were saying slavery's bad because it's not as good as free labor and trade. But these guys were actually, their views were coming from their religion. Their views were coming from the Bible. So it was God's word that guided them that slavery was wrong. So again, it goes against the men of their times myth. One of these guys, Granville Sharp, around this time, 1786 to 1787, he come up with this plan for a utopia for the black poor of London, because London now had a lot of poor black people, and Sharp came up with a plan to relocate them to Sierra Leone. Now, the problem is he trusted a con man. He didn't know he was a con man, but he trusted someone who told him there was a good bit of land in Sierra Leone that would be great for them. What he didn't know was that it was susceptible to flooding and disease. And so Sharp came up with a plan for this great community. He gave specific guidance of how to temporarily set up a community that would work well there. Even came up with a currency that they could use, a system of money. But when they got there, they arrived at the worst possible time. Okay. It was the worst possible time for weather, and they set up their accommodation. They planted their seeds, and then the rainy season came and just destroyed everything. They couldn't hunt in the jungle because the jungles were too thick, and mosquitoes and dysentery killed off loads of them. So one of the black poor, that's kind of what they got called, I don't know a better phrase, Abraham Elliot Griffith wrote a letter to Sharp. I'll let you read it later there in the handout. He explains to them this terrible situation they're in. Sharp, in not one of his best moments. We got to bear in mind, like, Sharp's a proper hero. Like, he did so much good. He's a good guy, but he got the letter from Abraham Elliot Griffith, and Sharp basically blamed their overindulgence in alcohol more than the climate. Now there were problems going on with alcohol. But Sharp felt like that's really the bigger problem. And if they would just follow his guidance, they would, quote, become the freest and happiest people on earth, end quote. So Sharp didn't initially trust Griffith's assessment, but he did trust a con man, and he trusted his own faulty evaluation. What this shows us is that even the most passionate activists can be biased, And in some ways, I don't want to mention this story because it's kind of like we don't know exactly what was going through Granville Sharp's mind. And maybe when we meet him in heaven, we'll find out that this interpretation of him isn't quite right. But it seems that it's an important story to tell, because I think we need to be honest that sometimes we can be fighting for people whilst we've still got some colonial mindset in our own mind, where we might be thinking, well, the way I understand things is a bit better than them, and not trusting their evaluations of situations, but just trusting our own assessment of situations. Okay, 1789, William Elford, an abolitionist, publishes an image of a slave ship called Brooks, and it shows all the people packed into rows. You've probably seen this picture or a similar one. So he was using his voice to demonstrate that through the arts that image bearers weren't treated with dignity. Same year, Alauda Equiano's book is published, called An Interesting Narrative of the Life of Alauda Equiano. Get the book. You can download a PDF for free, totally legally. This was published a long time ago. If you want a critical edition with all the textual variants, you're going to have to pay for that, But it's well worth getting the book or the audio book. You want to hear this guy's story. He was a Nigerian boy who was kidnapped and then transported through the Middle Passage to Virginia, and then ended up in England, and he became a Christian and became an abolitionist. And he started in 1787, and his book was massive in England. So many people read it. Like, you've got to read it. He started a group called the Sons of Africa, Okay, and he started it to end slavery. Okay, and him and Ottobah, he set it up with, they saw the need to be a pan-African group. They wanted to get Africans together, working together on this. And this group of former slaves, or children of slaves sometimes, they wrote letters and they gave speeches. So they're using their voice to get the message out there. And Equiano also, check this out, he teamed up with a working class organisation called the London Corresponding Society. Okay, now back then, first, I'm going to say this was like a white working class organisation, but I also want us to realise that the term white working class is a quite modern term. Okay, so I just want to make sure you understand I'm not using it anachronistically. But what I'm saying is there were these working class guys who were white, and Equiano's like, I'm going to team up with you guys. The founder of the London Corresponding Society, Thomas Hardy, said this: an advocate from principle for liberty for a black man will strenuously promote and support the rights of a white man and vice versa. Okay, please read that again later when you've got time as well. I think it's so important. You had Africans and white working class people working together. They had the shared principle of liberty and human rights. Contrast this with the slave code 20 years earlier, give or take, where people were actually like, we need to separate the white indentured servants from the black slaves. We want to get them thinking of separate identities of black and white. Well, what Equiano realized and what Thomas Hardy realized was like the people at the bottom of the pile, the white people, and the black people at the bottom of the pile need to work together and help each other out because it's the same principles that we're fighting for. And I think that's so important today, isn't it? Because today people are trying to divide us again. You know, some people are doing it maybe because they're trying to get votes. Who knows what all the different motivations are. But as Christians, if we take our guidance from the Bible, then we should be seeing more of coming together and working together to walk justly and do what is right. And actually that bit in is it Micah 6:8 where it says that is the penultimate line in Equiano's biography, where he basically says, well, isn't that how we're supposed to do all of our life? And read the book. So what you got here is image bearers using their voices and forging relationships. Remember, relationship is part of the function of being made in the image of God. Relationships to spread God's loving rule together, which hints that we need to be doing more of that today. Okay, 1791, you get the Haitian Slave Rebellion, which resulted in emancipation. So this was before British emancipation. So obviously, bear in mind, it's not really true to say the British ended slavery and Wilberforce ended slavery, although it's great what Wilberforce did. Slavery had been ended first in Haiti. And it is the only instance of the slaves overthrowing slavery themselves. And it's quite amazing. This ended up being one of the factors for the British ending slavery in the next century, because the British didn't want to see a similar thing happen to them. In this decade, in the 90s, you had a German professor called Christoph Miners, and he made a hierarchy of skin tones amongst Europeans. So you can see this fascination with skin colour. It wasn't enough to just say, well, you got the Mongolians and the Africans and the Europeans. Now you've got guys saying, well, what about the different skin tones amongst Europeans? And he said that he gave Germans the prime place with the whitest, most blooming and most delicate skin. I wonder why a German professor came up with that conclusion. And he compared the German white skin to the dirty white, quote unquote, skin of non-German Europeans. And he also said that the Germans had a, quote, purity of blood, end quote. Remember, we saw that from one of the philosophers earlier, this concept of how one group could be tainted by another. Well, according to Miners, the Germans had a purity of blood. And this notion spread westwards in Europe. So it didn't just stay in Germany. So now even Europeans themselves had a hierarchy of skin tones amongst themselves centered on whiteness. Okay, we mentioned Wilberforce a minute ago. 1794 to 99. Wilberforce began introducing bills for abolition of the slave trade, which each year were voted down. You got to give him props for that, right? Just keeps coming back each year, introducing this bill. Now, he had a nemesis called George Hibbert, and this guy was working against him the whole time. And guess what? They went to the same church, Holy Trinity on Clapham Common. So there were wildly opposing views in the church. Communion must have been so awkward for Wilberforce and Hibbert. But Wilberforce was using his assessment, his voice, and his power to serve and protect, like Adam was supposed to do in the garden, like we're supposed to do. The same time period, tragically, a series of massacres began in Australia that reduced the indigenous Australians and Tasmanians by 80%. Okay, to imagine 80% of a whole people group wiped out. The idea here was that the Aboriginals were at the bottom of the race system. They were doomed to distinction. So people talked of smoothing the pillow of a dying race. And people used their power not just to rule over other people, which was the whole thing of the, colonizing Australia, but they were actually decimating people compared with what it tells us about what the image of God was supposed to do in Genesis 1, 26 to 28. Same time period, 1974 to 1803, you had a scientist called Ebenezer Sibley, and he said, "We must consider white as the stock whence all others have sprung, Adam and Eve and their posterity, till the time of the deluge, were white. In the first age of the world, no black nation was to be found on the face of the earth." Now, I don't know where he got this from, but somehow a scientist thought he worked out that the earliest people were all white. So again, it's centering things on whiteness. Now, back to Blumenbach, 1795. He's done his third edition now on the natural variety of mankind. And now he says, look, folks, basically, you look around there, there's 12 different ways of classifying humans. So you should just choose which one of them you like best. So he's acknowledging this whole classifying humanity up into different races, getting a little bit funny. There's 12 different systems. Just pick your favorite. And of course, he gave us his system, which was had a hierarchy of skin tone, where, quote, the white color holds the first place, and then the yellow olive tinge, and then the copper, and then the tawny, and then the tawny black last, which is up to almost a pitchy blackness. So it means like jet black. Now, what he also did, which is really significant, is he introduced the term Caucasian. Okay. And he says this, he says, and the funny thing with the term Caucasian is technically Caucasian actually means that you live in the Caucasus, which means you live near, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So yeah, it's where Armenia is. Okay. So look that up on a map later. Funnily enough, when people say Caucasian, they're not really talking about people from Armenia these days. But there's a history behind how they got the word Caucasian, and you can read Painter's book, History of the White People, to find out how the term came about. But what he said about it was, we consider most handsome and becoming. So the Caucasian people were seen as the most handsome people. And he said that they were from Europe, North Africa, and India. Okay. and that Caucasian was the original group from which other groups came, but other groups degenerated from it. So Caucasus was the biggest one. So for me, it's interesting that Caucasian is a term that gets used in America, doesn't it? America, the police are always using Caucasian. In jurisprudence in America, they say Caucasian. In the last few years in England, people have started saying it over here. What's that about, Britain? Why are we now saying Caucasian? Like, it's not a helpful term. It's kind of crazy. So guys, please, let's stop using it. Okay, notice there's still no consensus on how to classify all the races. Now, at the end of the century, 1799, there's a British surgeon called Charles White, and in a chart, he ordered skulls in a hierarchy from the left to right, starting with an ape, then a Negro, then an American savage, then an Asiatic, and then 3 Europeans. Okay, you had 3 European skulls, and the one on the far right was an ancient Greek. Okay, and he uses the term species sometimes instead of using the term race. And he says that God created different coloured origins of humanity. So, in other words, he was a Polygenist. So, what we basically see in this century, and by the end of this century, is that European culture was seen as the standard by which other people were judged. And whiteness was seen as what original humanity was, and that anyone who wasn't white had either degenerated from being white, or they were descended from some other sort of Adam and Eve group somewhere else, and they weren't as good as white. And anyone who didn't have a European lifestyle was seen as not reaching their potential as humans. So again, Jesus wasn't the benchmark of how to be an image bearer. Instead, the European lifestyle was seen as the benchmark. And that's also why it's worth reading Equiano's book, because you hear him talk about, so he was Igbo, and you hear him talk about his culture and the shock it was once he came across Europeans and what their culture was like. And he also talks about what slavery was like in Africa and contrasts it with transatlantic and European slavery. So well worth reading that to get more of a handle on this stuff. Oh, that was a lot of stuff. So that was a whole 100 years we went through. So I'm sure I've missed out a lot, but use the footnotes, if you want to look up more of this stuff and learn more about this stuff. Does anyone have any questions?
This is just a generic question, really. Would you say there's any Polygynists today as Christians? That's because why I asked that is because I don't want to name him, but this theologian, Duncan. He's an American theologian, and he's a theistic evolutionist. And in his commentary on Genesis, he says that there was different types of humans at the start that came from apes. Would that be counted as a Polygyny?
It's a really good question. I don't know what terms these kids are using these days. But I'll say this. Today, if you are a theistic evolutionist, then given the history of some of these ideas, and given the present climate we're in today, it would be worth reinterrogating those views and trying to work out, if you really do think that does fit with Scripture, is there a way that it fits with Scripture that doesn't actually buy into pseudoscience ideas of so-called race? And are there caveats? I think that's what I'm trying to say. Are there caveats in presenting that view? How do you hold that position that doesn't support some racist ideas? And I'm sure there is a way of doing that. So I'm not trying to say there isn't. But I think people need to think it through, because one day you'll be having a conversation with someone thinking that by explaining theistic evolution, you've dealt with an apologetical question, and you've actually just stepped right into another one where someone says, hang on a minute, isn't that like what that slave owner said?
And to be honest, most people now in the States are not talking about theistic evolution. They're talking about Black Lives Matter. They're talking about inequality and stuff like that. And so if you somehow get onto creation and you start talking about that, and people are clued up because they've read a Carla, you could end up in trouble.
Yeah.
So we talked about how people are not using Jesus as the pinnacle and as the benchmark like they should be. Instead, they're looking to Germans or ancient Greeks or Europeans. Have you come across anyone or any point where someone's used Jesus and his human heritage as a counter argument? Say, hang on, Jesus never even came to Europe. Like, he is obviously not an ancient Greek. Where does he fit into all of this?
That's a really good question. Are you talking about back then in the 1700s?
Back then in the 1700s, but also now, is it a prominent argument now as well?
Yeah. So I think that today, I feel like, so in my research in the 1700s, I didn't come across people saying, hang on a minute, Jesus is the benchmark. But to be fair, there was so much stuff that I could only, what I presented to you guys is just scratching the surface. So I don't know enough to say whether people did or not. And I had to stop researching in the end, because in the end I was like, look, if I carry on researching, I'm basically going to have too much material, and we have to spend, an hour on each decade, and we won't be done for another 10 years or something. But in terms of today, I think that there is an increasing number of people who are pointing out that Jesus is the benchmark. And so I think that's happened across the board. So even now, when I've seen people have conversations about masculinity and what is biblical masculinity, I've seen some people pointing out, well, surely biblical masculinity would be to be a bit more like Christ. Whereas other people have said biblical masculinity is when you go hunting and start bonfires and do barbecues, and some people are saying, well, I don't know if Jesus did any of those things, So that's something that I've encouragingly seen happen more and more in the last few years. In the circles I moved in, it wasn't something I heard of much in the last 30 years. But would anyone else in the group want to comment on that?
I don't know if this answers the question, but Felix from LCM did a debate with a Pan-African conference with a traditional religious African guy, and he used the premise of Jesus being the benchmark and how Christianity is not a white man's religion. And I think that's on a website somewhere. So I'll try and get the link and send it to you, and you can forward it on. So that was his argument. And the guy and the African traditionalist religious guy actually said, you've made a good point. And it changed his view on Christianity a bit.
That's really helpful. Thanks. All right then, guys. Well, it's great to see you all, and hope you get some good rest tonight. I know it's been a long day. We're doing this session after a hard day's work. So take care, everyone, and God bless.
Thanks, Doug. See you next month, right?
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.